The focus of the presentation I'm going to give today is about how the world is changing, and specifically how 6 societal and corporate trends are going to change the way we live and work. And so when it comes to us as employees, when it comes to companies, how should we operate in this brave new world? How can we succeed? And I wanted to start by talking to you about this quote from Leon C. Megginson speaking on Darwin's Origin of Species that states, "It is not the most intellectual of the species that survives. It is not the strongest that survives, but the species that survives is the one that is able best to adapt and adjust to the changing environment in which it finds itself." And so as I continue through this presentation, please keep this quote in mind and think about in your own specific situation. If you believe me, if you believe in the trends that I'm about to describe, how will you be able to adapt and adjust to this changing environment? How will your company adapt and adjust to the changing environment that we will soon find ourselves? And for a little bit of background in terms of my career in gaming, that started about 10 years ago when I founded a mobile game studio called Playviews. And from there did some consulting for large Asian mobile game publishers like Smilegate and Renren Games. I then joined a company called FunPlus and was able to spend some time in China, specifically in Beijing, and led the game development for a game called King of Avalon. And then having worked on the game development side, I kind of shifted into publishing, working both at Sega and NBC Universal. And some of you may also know me from some of the social media stuff that I do. So I have a podcast that I co-host with a few other folks on the Deconstructor of Fun, and have the Game Makers YouTube channel as well. But given that, let's go ahead and jump into the presentation. And I'd like to start with the key societal and corporate trends that I had mentioned. And specifically, there are actually 3 societal trends I want to talk about, and then 3 corporate trends I would like to discuss. On the societal trends, it first starts with the proliferation of social media, which may sound obvious, but I'll go into that into more detail. Secondly, what I call the emergence of the digital footprint. Third, work-life integration. And on the corporate trend side, the rise of globalization and communication. Fifth, the externalization of the enterprise. And finally, the impact of culture and values. So now, upon hearing these trends, part of what you may now be thinking as well, geez, these 6 trends sound really boring, or this is kind of obvious, but please bear with me. Please walk through a couple of these trends with me, because I do think that what you will find is that there are implications that are a lot more relevant than you may otherwise think. But let's go ahead and jump into this first trend around the proliferation of social media. And again, we start with something that does feel and sound very obvious, that the growth of social media has been very dramatic, and it's been increasing dramatically to the point where we can almost expect everyone to be using social media. And the point is that we now have not only this dramatic proliferation across everybody, but that there is this one-to-N and potentially one-to-everybody connection that exists because of this social media fabric that exists in our society. And when we think about 2 major consequences of this social media proliferation, there's really 2 points that I want to make as far as this trend is concerned. The first has to do with increased transparency, that now, because of this connectedness that we have, that whatever you do has a potential to be very open and public. And so make sure you can live with the publicity of any actions that you have. And secondly is emergence of personal brands. And when I talk about personal brands, I don't mean just very famous social influencers, but if we think about brands a little bit more generally right now, think about how consumers think of brands. Generally speaking, consumers think of brands at 2 levels, either at the company level or at the product level. That's how consumers typically think of brands. But what's starting to happen when we think about the proliferation of social media, that one-to-N connection, is that gives us the ability to break through the company level, to break through the product level, and to really have a connection with the people that are a part of the company, the people that are making the product. Now, does this happen? Well, when we look in other industries, for example, entertainment, it does. So people aren't just interested in the movie or the television show. They're interested in who is the director, who are the actors. And at that level, in that industry, that occurs. That these actors, these directors get huge followings on social media because that level of fandom has broken through the product and to the people making the product. Now, I believe that this trend will actually become more generalized in that the attention is going to shift to the people making the product. And so let's dive into each of these areas in a little bit more detail, starting with increased transparency. With a few quotes from the very famous social media expert and entrepreneur Gary Vaynerchuk. And so two things that he talks about that happens with this increased transparency is that one, good intentions become very important. And so he states, quote, "In a world with all these social networks, everything is transparent. In an environment like this, people who have good intent are going to win and people who come from a bad place are going to lose." And so what we've been seeing, whether it's bad actors being exposed on Twitter as part of the Me Too movement, or just general bad behavior that's been posted on Facebook, today, every single person has a mobile phone and can record and distribute, accessible to everybody in the world, any kinds of bad behavior that actually occurs. And the second point that Gary Vaynerchuk makes is around authenticity. And so he states, quote, "The truth is people who are fake will never last. The best strategy for building a personal brand is to be 100% you without watering down your personality in any way." And so again, implications in terms of the transparency is one, to have good intentions, and two, to not try to fake it, to really be yourself. And now let's talk about the personal brands aspect, right? And just more generally speaking, I think if we think about what social media is doing, allowing this kind of personal connection that hasn't existed before. And I mentioned this ability for social media to pierce through the company layer, to pierce through the product layer to the person. Not only kind of social media stars, not just people in the entertainment industry, but other people that work on products that people love are going to get the same level of exposure that a lot of these social media guys are getting today. And when we think about what's happened now because of YouTube, because of Twitter, because of Instagram, and in the slides I show, for example, Ninja, who has over 14 million followers and has become so influential because of Twitch and YouTube that he was paid $50 million to stream on Mixer instead of Twitch. The guys like Jonathan Blow, who may only have 120,000 followers, but because he's so well respected that he has a very strong audience and a lot of people that really pay a lot of attention to him. And Kylie Jenner, who, because of her social media following, has been able to become a billionaire, right? And create Kylie Cosmetics, which I think now is valued even more, but I think at the time was valued at $1.2 billion. And this is all from the power of creating a personal brand, all from the power that's been enabled by a lot of these social networks that have proliferated our society to such a strong degree. So now I want to talk about the second trend, which is the emergence of what I'm calling the digital footprint. And I wanted to start this conversation by talking about the comparison of a resume to what I'm calling the digital footprint. And to date, a lot of people have based job interviews and the ability to evaluate and hire talent at companies based upon this essentially piece of paper. And what I've noticed is that in my own experience, when it comes to resumes, one, a lot of resumes did not have enough information about candidates. And that also, when I looked at a lot of resumes and when I discussed a lot of points in resumes with candidates, very oftentimes there was a falseness, right? That people had written a lot of things in the resume that weren't even true. And so my belief is that this thing that I call a digital footprint is going to be more important. So what do I mean by that? So for me, the last 3 jobs that I got were because I had this blog, this Game Makers blog, which I've now more focused on YouTube. but that because of a lot of the stuff that I had written in terms of the games industry, that had a disproportionate impact on me being able to get the jobs that I got. Now, in addition to that, what I mean by digital footprint are all of your work, all of your thoughts, your ability to show your skill as a potential future employee. Now, whether that's a blog, a YouTube channel, a podcast, or stuff that you have on Instagram, Twitter, or LinkedIn, I believe that increasingly is going to be a bigger determinant in terms of employers' evaluation of you as an employee relative to this thing that we call a resume. Now, I'm not saying that the resume is going to be completely worthless, but in my view, so this is a conceptual drawing that I'm showing, my prediction for the digital footprint is that increasingly, what I'm calling the digital footprint is going to have a stronger and stronger impact in terms of candidate evaluation than this resume, which again, oftentimes is very false and does not paint a full picture of a candidate relative to actual projects that you've worked on, actual thoughts that you have, that you've written down, that you've digitized, that you've put into a format and into the internet that people can access and evaluate. And I'm actually quite shocked when I look at candidates and I evaluate people, how few people have a blog or how few people have written down their thoughts and have posted them. But I will say that anytime someone does have a blog or a YouTube channel or a podcast, I've always went and researched what they have done. So kind of tying back the first trend to the second trend, I want to talk about the PageRank algorithm. So in 1996, Larry Page developed the PageRank algorithm, which was essentially the basis of the search engine at that time that we now know as Google. And just looking at Wikipedia in terms of how this PageRank algorithm works, Wikipedia describes it as follows. PageRank works by counting the number and quality of links to a page to determine a rough estimate of how important the website is. The underlying assumption is that more important websites are likely to receive more links from other websites. And this PageRank algorithm was essentially the basis. So back in the day, you had like Alta Vista, Lycos, you had all these search algorithms, but really it was this algorithm that really was the basis of competition. It was the key driver that allowed Google to compete against all the other sort of directory-based and other types of search engines that existed at that time. So why do I bring this up? Why do I talk about PageRank, this algorithm for websites? Well, I'd like to direct your attention to the diagram that depicts conceptually and graphically PageRank for websites, and now look at the diagram that shows you the social graph. And if you can notice, you notice the similarities. And in fact, conceptually, these are just nodes. A website is a node with links. People, because of the social networking and social graph infrastructure, are just nodes with links. And so my argument is that the more of a digital footprint you have, the more connections to you, the quality and quantity of those links based upon your digital footprint is going to give you a rank. And I would submit to you that this already exists to some degree. I believe that in Facebook, you have a number. I believe that in LinkedIn, you have a number. YouTube definitely has an algorithm for your YouTube channel. And so this notion of being ranked based upon your social graph, based upon your digital footprint, is something that I believe is going to become increasingly important and relevant in the future. So when I think about my own activities from a digital footprint perspective, I would argue that it's actually a great time to be building up a social media following. But as with all platforms, the earlier the better, and you do need to be consistent. So on the left-hand side, I show the Deconstructor of Fun podcast growth. So since we started this kind of new segment on the Deconstructor podcast, it's grown very quickly. I think we're at like 200,000 listens now, but like the growth has been quite dramatic. And the advantage was that we got into podcasting much earlier than other folks. On YouTube, it's been a slog. I've noticed that it's very slow but steady growth. I'd say it's actually plateaued for me a little bit. It's been a lot harder, but this is a platform I think where I'm going to have to play the long game. But the point is that you have to pick the channels that make the most sense for you. I think you have to be consistent, and I think you have to invest over time for this digital footprint to drive value for you. But just to also give you a sense of how powerful this can be. So this is a YouTube video that I created. It was an interview with a friend of mine who works at Riot Games that talks about product management at Riot Games. And you can even see that I've been struggling with YouTube, and I'm very open about that. And you can see that the growth on YouTube was like very, very flat. But even with a very small audience, you can get dramatic reach. And so I show here in this slide kind of the reach that this post has had after I promoted it on LinkedIn. And so you can see here that this post got over 300 people from Riot that had viewed this post. And we've got a lot of relevant people from Riot to Electronic Arts to Blizzard to Amazon to Google to Rovio that checked out this post. And, certainly many people watched the video. One of the first videos that I did on YouTube has over 5,000 views. And so I just want to underscore just how powerful even my YouTube channel, which is, very small, how powerful that can be. Like, how many people will attend a GDC conference? Will you get 5,000 people to view your talk? Even with a small focused audience, that you can actually reach very many relevant people that could potentially have a dramatic impact on your career and your future. Okay, so what are the implications of this PageRank model against people or employees? So two kind of concluding thoughts here is one, I believe you should start now. Start building your personal PageRank now, because if it's anything like what I'm trying to do on YouTube, it takes years. And even the podcast, which is now, again, it's been growing very, very significantly. That's something I've been working on for, almost 2 years. And I think the second thing is to do real valuable work. My point being that the more actual real work, real thinking projects you've worked on, that you do and document, the better for you to start building this personal PageRank. I believe these social networks, and the right one is going to be different for every person, but what you post, how you post, which channels you use, that's going to be personal. But these platforms should be a channel for you to communicate and distribute information about your personal value. All right. So the third trend is work-life integration. And when we look at a lot of the headlines today, in fact, we hear more about work-life balance. And so the headlines, books, Harvard Business Review often talk about work-life balance and how important work-life balance is for your personal and mental health and things like that. But on the flip side, in 2010, I was able to attend a talk by the CEO of Evernote at that time, a guy by the name of Phil Lieben, who talked about a completely different concept that he called work-life integration. And the point I wanted to make here is that, one of the things that he argued for is that sometimes balance is not actually good, and that instead of trying to run away from work, why not integrate your personal life and your work life? One of the quotes that he had is as follows. I don't believe in work-life balance. I don't think those are two things that you balance against each other. I believe in life's work. I believe that you work on something that's sufficiently epic, and that's what you want to spend your time on. And so when you think about it, not to take anything away from people who do believe in work-life balance, and that's a personal choice. But on the flip side, I believe that you should also consider the option of spending your work on something that you believe in so much that you will also spend hours outside of normal working hours, and that you love it so much that your personal life and your work life, that boundary disappears because it's more efficient. It's more efficient to blend your personal and work life. And, what's the argument for why you should completely separate the two? If you love your work so much, it shouldn't make a difference. Now, I want to also talk about some other related trends to consider in light of work-life balance. And really three things. First is this concept of 10,000 hours. And so in the slide, you can see a picture of Billie Eilish, the famous singer, and her brother Phineas. And that picture that you see that says 10,000 hours was written on top of Phineas's bedroom door, that he looked at that every day because that's what he used to drive himself to become so talented at such a young age, that he loved what he did so much and he practiced so much. He put in the work and the effort. And so one of the questions that I have for you is that, given the world that we're living in, if you have people like that putting in their 10,000 hours or 20,000 hours or however many hours, how can you be competitive? And the second trend is that we are living in a world of increasing complexity and competition. And so the futurist Kevin Kelly, in an essay that he wrote, talks about how over time, this is kind of like a universal trend that complexity increases. And with increasing complexity, is 9 to 5, does that make sense? In order to compete, given such depth and such complexity in the world we live in, it's going to be harder and harder to just have that 9 to 5, in my opinion. And finally is the impact of AI and machine learning on jobs. That there was a technology created by Google, the contact center AI, and it was found that in a study that the artificial intelligence was able to serve customers better in terms of phone support than actual people. So the point I wanted to make here in the context of work-life balance, work-life integration, and again, I don't want to take anything away from people who desire work-life balance, but in the face of the requirement for depth, higher competition, and potentially fewer jobs because a lot of jobs are limited by AI, work-life balance may not be a luxury that everybody has. And so just keep that in mind when you consider work-life integration relative to work-life balance. So some concluding thoughts on all of this is, one, I really think you need to find something you love, because if you love it, you'll be able to build depth and expertise over time. You'll be able to really, really spend time with it, and it won't feel like work. Secondly, I do believe that greatness does require imbalance. To do anything truly great in life, you have to really focus on it. I think it's a fantasy to think that you can just try and dabble in something and be great at it. I don't think that exists. And then finally, eliminating inefficiency. So my point here is that in the face of the depth, complexity, etc., that for you to be more efficient and effective, you're going to have to eliminate inefficiency everywhere. So whether it's ineffective meetings, how you manage your time, even how you dress to work, like ties actually don't make any sense at all. It's just a waste of time, right? And so all the unnecessary stuff in your life, if you eliminate that, that can also help you live a little bit more of a balanced life. And that'll give you more time to spend towards developing the depth and expertise that you need to be more competitive. So I want to now shift over to the remaining three trends, the corporate trends, as we've now wrapped up the societal trends. And those three trends are the rise of globalization and communication, externalization of the enterprise, and the impact of culture and values. So let's jump into the rise of globalization and communication. So I wanted to open with this question of, what is the impact of increasing globalization and communication on companies today? What do you think the key implications of these two key trends are? And in my view, it's really three things. First, increased competition. Globalization opens up competition to anyone around the globe. in that with increased communication, the ability to become aware of and to compete for different projects globally becomes that much easier. And even further, when we think of a platform that's a global platform, like, for example, mobile phones, that on a single platform, a developer can create an application that's accessed from anybody globally. So we have that first impact in terms of increased competition. The second is emergence of highly efficient and distributed teams, which I will talk about. And the third is information leakage, which I'll save for a little bit later in this presentation. But let's now talk about the emergence of highly efficient and distributed teams. Now, last year in August, there was a company by the name of Seriously that was acquired for $275 million by Playtika. They were a mobile gaming studio, and I profiled them here as a model of this move towards highly efficient and distributed teams. And so they're an example of a company that took advantage of geographically advantageous regions and distribute their companies across these different regions for maximum efficiency and effectiveness. And there were other reasons why Seriously was successful, but I do think a key area of structural and competitive advantage came from the fact that first, in terms of the Finland team, they were able to have most of their development come out of Finland, which has lower salaries. It also has government tax credits and has a highly efficient and well-skilled labor force to make mobile games. And then the other part of the company, they located in Los Angeles. So certainly California is a lot closer to first-party platforms. You have access to a lot of great user acquisition talent, and they were located in LA, close to the major Hollywood studios, because in addition to the original IP they were developing, they wanted relationships with major IPs and brands. And so I think that increasingly this type of a structure, taking advantage of geographical differences and regional advantages, is going to become increasingly popular. And all of this is enabled, again, because of these things, the increase in terms of globalization, the increase in terms of communication. And when we think about the impact of this cost structure advantage, for example, when we talk about a company like Seriously, we see that it's pretty significant. That if we were to look at the average software engineering salary by location and compare San Francisco to Helsinki, well, it's on the face of it not super dramatic. It's about 45% of San Francisco, but when you then factor in the tax breaks from the government, it becomes about a fourth of the cost of San Francisco. Now compare that to Changzhou, China, and that's 18%. So let's say 20%. So about 1/5 the cost of San Francisco. And we can just look at the public financial statements of some of the, from a gaming perspective, companies like Zynga and Glue, which have SF-based offices, and look at their R&D spend against bookings. And we can see that these companies, which have headquarters in San Francisco relative to their offshore counterparts like Nexon, Rovio, Gung-Ho, and NCSoft, are half of that. So my point is that these companies that are able to take advantage of geographical cost advantages are going to have a significant cost structure advantage. And so all things being equal, who wins with a 4 to 5x advantage in cost structure? So it's like baseball. Let's say we gave one team 12 strikes at bat relative to another team that gets only 3 strikes at bat. Well, this is a pretty significant advantage. And so all things being equal over time, I think this is an advantage that cannot be overcome. And now I wanted to talk about externalization of the enterprise. So, from the advent of the internet, if we take it back to 1995, and when we look at the structure and the way that workflow and processes worked in corporations back in 1995, we saw that almost everything was internalized. So whether it was the workflows or processes with strategic partners and strategic customers, when it came to applications and employees, everything was on-site, on-premise, and captured within the company. But with the internet, with the improvement of security protocols, and with increasing globalization communication, what we found was that increasingly what we had were a lot of these functions starting to get externalized. And so whether it's applications that became increasingly web-based and delivered from the cloud, whether it's employees that weren't necessarily on-premise, that could work at different offices, that could work from home, could work in a different office geographically, and the workflows, information sharing, and data with strategic partners and customers also became increasingly externalized. And so I believe that this trend that occurred between 1995 to 2015 will experience a second wave of externalization. And so I'm arguing that what we will now see with some of the trends that I've talked about, with the proliferation of social media, with personal brands, with people talking about how they work, and with globalization and communication, the last trend that I talked about, how many of you are on Slack channels with a group of your peers in similar functional roles sharing information? I'm arguing that what's likely next in terms of the second wave of externalization are going to be things like processes, best practice, strategy, that increasingly it's going to become very difficult to keep these things a secret and locked within a specific corporation. So if this is true, if this trend continues, then the key question that remains here is, then what remains as core strategic advantage within the corporation? And so a couple of implications that I'd like to conclude this section about is, one, future corporate identity. What keeps a company together? What does it actually even mean to be a company when so much is going to be increasingly externalized? And secondly, how will you retain employees? For many companies, they will only be a loose organizational structure that pays the bills. So those companies that want to retain their employees and create value are going to have to dig deeper into what it means to be a company. And now we come to our final trend, the impact of culture and values. And I wanted to start this section by first thinking back in terms of the early work environments, right? So when we think about, the manufacturing area, the early 1900s, in the old days, the culture of an organization in those days actually didn't matter. It didn't really matter that much because the work in the corporate environment were actually very simple. So you had simple tasks, you had highly structured work, you had this complete separation of work and home life, and work from different employees was relatively indistinguishable on the factory floor, right? But today, the increasing complexity of the environment in which we work, the increasing complexity of the products and services being worked on, creates a massive challenge for management and around coordination. So the impact of increasing competition and complexity includes things like, one, for the corporation, for employees, you have to work harder and smarter. You need good communication. You need to eliminate politics and personality clashes. You need a system or number of systems delivering competitive advantage. You need to understand where the market is going. You need to understand very complex products very deeply. You need process and practice for complex design and development. You need all these different things being driven off of the back of increasing competition and complexity. And so the question then becomes, what is the solution? How do you deal with the growing requirements from increasing competition and complexity? What is the solution? And I would argue that the solution to all of this is actually culture and values as a corporate foundation. And I would submit to you that if you read no other business book in your life, read Principles by Ray Dalio. That if you believe me in terms of some of these other trends that are happening with the increasing externalization, what remains at the core of what it means to be a company? And that is exactly this, the principles, right? And so why? Why culture and values? Because as Ray Dalio states in Principles, companies fundamentally are just two things, culture and people. And so culture and values is the engine upon which a company will build and grow, and culture unlike information, cannot be easily taken or stolen by your competitors, right? So culture and values helps organize, manage, and motivate teams to perform to their best capability. And this is what is going to comprise strategic competitive advantage over the long term. Okay, so those were the 6 trends. And just in terms of a quick recap, the 3 societal trends: proliferation of social media, emergence of the digital footprint, work-life integration. And the 3 corporate trends: rise of globalization, communication, externalization of the enterprise, and impact of culture and values. And so another thought I wanted to leave you with is that, just kind of taking it back to the very first message, that quote about Darwin's Origin of Species, right? And when we think about technology actually over time changes exponentially. It changes very quickly. But take that in comparison to people. And I would say that when it comes to people, that people change very, very slowly. People are very difficult to change. And so if you believe in the trends I described, how will you change? How will your company change? What will you do? So let's take it back to Leonce Megginson's quote. It is not the most intellectual of the species that survives, and it is not the strongest that survives, but the species that survives is the one that is able best to adapt and adjust to the changing environment in which it finds itself. Thanks.